First story, The Haunting of Whispering Lake. It was a sunny Friday when a group of friends decided to spend the weekend fishing. Oliver, Hugo, Amelie, and Clara always enjoyed outdoor adventures, and this time, they chose a remote lagoon Oliver had heard about in an old local legend. According to the legend, the lagoon was known as a great fishing spot, but few dared to go there due to rumors of it being haunted. After a long car ride and a hike through steep trails, the friends finally arrived at the lagoon. It was a beautiful and tranquil place, surrounded by dense trees with calm waters reflecting the blue sky. They set up camp near the shore, excited about the prospect of a relaxing weekend. On the first night, as the group settled around the campfire, they began to hear strange whispers. Initially, they attributed the sounds to their imagination or nocturnal animals, but the whispers became clearer and closer, as if invisible voices were conversing among themselves. Clara suggested it was just the wind passing through the trees, but an unsettling feeling began to set in. On the second day, Hugo and Amelie were fishing when Hugo noticed something strange in the water. A large, indistinct shadow seemed to move beneath the surface but quickly disappeared. He tried to dismiss the incident as a large fish, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Later, while exploring the surroundings, Clara found an old fisherman's cabin half hidden among the trees. Inside, there were old fishing equipment and a dusty diary. Flipping through the diary, they discovered accounts of fishermen who mysteriously disappeared in strange visions at the lagoon. The last entry spoke of a fisherman who saw shadows in the waters and heard voices of the dead. That night, the whispers intensified, and the friends began to see ethereal figures around the camp. Oliver, who was always the most skeptical of the group, tried to confront one of the figures, but it vanished before he could approach. Fear began to grip the group. Amelie suggested they leave immediately, but Oliver insisted they stay and solve the mystery. They decided to keep a vigil by the lagoon to try to understand what was happening. As the night wore on, the ghostly figures became more defined. They appeared to be the spirits of the missing fishermen, wandering restlessly. One figure, in particular, with a look of deep despair, approached Amelie and whispered something in an unknown language. She felt a deep cold and fell to her knees, terrified. Hugo and Oliver rushed to help Amelie while Clara tried to fend off the figures with a flashlight. Suddenly, an invisible force pulled Hugo into the water. Oliver dived in after him but found only darkness and silence. When he surfaced, Hugo had vanished. Desperate, the remaining friends ran back to the camp, but they found their belongings scattered and the campfire extinguished. Clara, in tears, begged to leave. Oliver, finally convinced they were dealing with something beyond their understanding, agreed. Carrying what little they could gather, they ran down the trail back to the car, not looking back. The voices and figures continued to haunt them until they were far from the lagoon. When they returned to the camp, they realized their things were scattered, and the campfire was out. Clara was in tears, begging to leave. Oliver, finally convinced they were dealing with something beyond their understanding, agreed. As they hastily packed their things, the ghostly figures became more aggressive. The shadows of the dead fishermen seemed to surround them, blocking their exits. Oliver tried using the flashlight to drive them away, but the light seemed to pass through the figures without effect. One figure, in particular, who seemed to be the leader of the spirits, advanced toward Clara. She was paralyzed with fear, and the figure raised a translucent hand as if trying to touch her face. Oliver ran to her and tried to fend off the spirit, feeling a wave of ice pass through his body. Desperate, Oliver shouted for Amelie to look in the diary for a way to combat the spirits. Amelie frantically flipped through the pages until she found a passage about a liberation ritual. The ritual involved lighting a fire with a specific combination of herbs and reciting an ancient prayer. Amelie and Oliver ran to gather the herbs they had found in the cabin while Clara tried to keep the spirits at bay with the flashlight. The feeling of ice and despair grew with each passing second, and Hugo was still missing. Finally, they managed to light the fire with the herbs and began reciting the prayer. The ancient words echoed in the darkness, mingling with the spirits' whispers. The figures began to retreat, their forms becoming more nebulous and indistinct. But the leader of the spirits did not yield. He advanced, determined to interrupt the ritual. Oliver, in an act of bravery, grabbed a burning piece of wood from the fire and advanced toward the spirit, reciting the prayer with more intensity. The spirit briefly recoiled but then lunged at Oliver with renewed force. Amelie, realizing they needed more time, joined Clara in reciting the prayer, their voices uniting in a desperate chorus. The lead spirit hesitated, its form flickering between the world of the living and the dead. With one last effort, Oliver raised the burning wood and thrust it directly through the spectral figure. The spirit let out a piercing scream and disintegrated into a cold mist. The other spirits followed suit, dissipating into the night air. When the last shadow disappeared, calm returned to the lagoon. The silence was oppressive but no longer hostile. Hugo emerged from the water, disoriented but alive. They quickly pulled him to the shore and, without wasting more time, left the camp. Back at the car, the group remained silent, each lost in their thoughts about the terrible night they had survived. They promised never to return to that haunted lagoon and never to speak of what they had seen and faced. Years later, Oliver, Amelie, and Clara never spoke of that night again. The lagoon remained a place of mystery and fear, avoided by all who knew its story. And on the darkest nights, it was said that the whispers of the missing fishermen could still be heard, calling for help in the tranquil and treacherous waters. I dare you to like and subscribe to this channel, for few have the courage to keep listening to horror stories after arriving here. Now, let's move on to the next story. Second story, The Cursed Silver Lure. Alice and Thomas were facing a crisis in their marriage. The arguments were constant, and the emotional distance between them seemed to grow every day. In a desperate effort to save their relationship, Thomas suggested a fishing trip to a remote lake he used to visit with his father when he was a child. Alice, reluctant but hopeful, agreed. They believed that time together, away from everyday distractions, might help realign their relationship. On Saturday morning, they set off for the lake, bringing tents, fishing rods, and provisions. The path there was picturesque, surrounded by dense forests and distant mountains. When they arrived, the tranquil beauty of the place brought a sense of peace they hadn't felt in a long time. They set up camp by the lakeside and, for a brief moment, managed to forget their fights. However, while preparing the fishing rods, a heated argument began. Thomas accused Alice of not trying hard enough to resolve their problems, while Alice blamed him for never listening to her. The tension between them was palpable, and anger began to take over again. Then Thomas found an old silver lure in his tackle box. It looked much older than any other lure he had seen, with intricate designs engraved on it. He decided to use it, hoping that something different might bring a bit of luck and distraction. As he cast the lure into the water, a strange sensation filled the air. The calm waters of the lake began to stir slightly, and a cold breeze blew, making Alice shiver. They exchanged uneasy glances, but Thomas insisted they continue fishing. A few minutes later, Thomas felt a strong tug on the line. He struggled to hold onto the rod, and Alice, curious, moved closer to help. What emerged from the water was not a fish but a dark, ethereal figure that seemed to be made of mist and shadows. Its eyes glowed with deep hatred, and it moved supernaturally toward the couple. They tried to back away, but the figure advanced quickly, its ghostly claws reaching for Alice. Thomas grabbed a flashlight and tried to drive it away with the light, but the figure only seemed to grow stronger in their presence. Desperate, they ran back to the camp, but the creature followed, emitting malevolent whispers. Alice stumbled and fell, and the figure seized the moment to attack her. Thomas, in a panic, grabbed a burning piece of wood from the campfire and charged at the entity, but he was repelled by an invisible force. Alice screamed for help as she felt her life energy being drained by the creature. Thomas, not knowing what else to do, remembered something he had read in the diary of a fisherman found in the abandoned cabin. The silver lure belongs to the cursed. Only a sacrifice can break the curse. Without time to think, he took the lure and, with tears in his eyes, cast it back into the lake, reciting a desperate prayer. The figure paused for a moment, as if listening. Then it let out a deafening scream and disappeared into the depths of the lake, taking Alice with it. Thomas fell to his knees by the water, devastated and incredulous. He remained there, sobbing, feeling guilt and regret crushing his heart. The days that followed were unbearably silent. Thomas returned to the city, but his life was never the same. He lived consumed by sadness and remorse, constantly reminded of how his attempt to save the marriage resulted in the irreparable loss of his wife. His nights were haunted by nightmares, and he could swear he heard the whispers of the lake, calling to him, reminding him of his failure. The silver lure, now lost in the depths of the lake, continued to carry the curse, waiting for the next unwary fisherman who dared to use it. And Thomas, trapped in his own spiral of sorrow and regret, knew he would never escape the shadows of that fateful day. Third story, the spectral sailor of Marburg. The fishermen of the small coastal village of Marburg always murmured about the legend of the spectral sailor. They said he appeared on foggy nights, with glowing eyes and a ghostly figure, luring anyone who dared to venture out to sea. Emil, a young skeptical fisherman, never believed these stories. He considered it all silly superstition meant to keep children away from the sea at night. One night, the fog descended on the village like a thick blanket. Determined to prove that the legend was just a myth, Emil prepared his boat and set out to sea. His wife, Elise, worried, tried to dissuade him, but he was resolute. With a quick kiss and a promise to return, Emil sailed into the unknown. The sea was strange that night, the silence was oppressive, and visibility was almost non-existent. As he advanced, Emil began to feel a presence around him. The air was cold, and he could barely see beyond the bow of the boat. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the mist, a man in old sailor's clothes, his eyes glowing with a supernatural light. Emil stopped rowing, his heart racing. The figure, the spectral sailor, pointed to the horizon and began to whisper in an ancient, incomprehensible language. Emil tried to move away, but the boat seemed to be held by an invisible force. He grabbed an oar and tried to fend off the specter, but his hands passed right through the figure. Desperate, Emil remembered the stories of old fishermen about how the ghost was a lost soul, seeking companionship for his eternal journey. He began to shout for help, but his words were swallowed by the fog. The figure started to move closer, its eyes fixed on Emil. The boat began to spin in circles, pulled by a ghostly current. Emil felt the temperature drop even further, and the fog seemed alive, wrapping around him. He grabbed a protective talisman his grandmother had given him years ago, but the amulet slipped from his trembling hands and disappeared into the sea. The figure of the spectral sailor was now just a few steps away. Emil could see the man's features, pale and consumed by sorrow. He tried to move, but he was paralyzed with fear. The ghost raised a translucent hand and touched Emil's shoulder. An intense cold swept through his body, and he felt as if his soul was being sucked out. Emil screamed, a sound of pure terror that echoed across the empty sea. He summoned all his willpower to grab the last oar and row with all his might. The ghost tried to hold him, but Emil managed to break free and roll frantically towards the village. When the shore finally came into view, Emil was exhausted and nearly out of strength. The ghost had disappeared, but the young fisherman knew that the experience had changed him forever. He disembarked, staggering, and was found by Elise, who was anxiously waiting on the beach. Emil collapsed into her arms, trembling and unable to speak. The entire village woke up to his cries of fear, and the people soon learned that the legend of the spectral sailor was not just a fisherman's tale. From that night on, no one dared to challenge the fog, and Emil's name was always remembered as the man who survived the encounter with the spectral sailor. The presence of the ghost, though never seen again, was felt by everyone. And Emil, with eyes that had seen the other side, spent the rest of his days recounting the story, warning young fishermen to never underestimate the legends of the sea.